The next 3 lectures are over chapters 16 and 17 from the book. And there's a lot of vocabulary words with these 2 chapters, so I'm going to go over a few of them now and a few later in the lectures. Okay, we have variation. Members of a population differ from one another. So you are different from the person sitting next to you. You are different than your siblings due to variation. And when we talk a population, we're talking about population within a species. So cardinals would be a population. Robins would be a population. Robins and cardinals cannot reproduce and have offspring, so they are of 2 different species. So when we say population, we're talking about organisms of the same species. So when we're talking variation, we would not compare a robin to a cardinal. We'd compare a cardinal to another cardinal or a robin to another robin. So one robin is different than another one because of variation. Differential reproduction. Some phenotypes are more fit and reproduce to a greater degree than other phenotypes. There are phenotypes out there that have allowed organisms to survive, and if they're surviving, they're able to have babies. If you had a squirrel that had white fur, that phenotype's not going to allow them to survive very long. They would get eaten, so the white fur would not be passed on from generation to generation. But squirrels with the red fur, they can blend in, they're able to hide, so they can reproduce, they can have babies. Inheritance. Differences in a population are due to their genes. You know that already. Accumulation of adapted traits. With each generation, characteristics contributing to reproductive success increase with frequency. That makes sense. If there is a phenotype out there that's allowing an organism to survive, it's going to be able to have babies, and it's going to pass on that trait to its children because it has the genes in them, so it'll give the genes to the kids. And so from generation to generation to generation, you'll see that trait show up. If it's a trait that they need for survival, it will be there each generation. Darwin proposed natural selection as a way species of organisms can change over time. Natural selection is a process by which organisms best suited to their environment are most likely to survive and reproduce than organisms less suited for their environment. So if you have an organism out there and they have these good genes, they're going to be able to reproduce and have babies. The babies are going to have these good genes, and generation to generation to generation. If there is an organism out there and it's not healthy, it has some disease, or it can't blend in, it's going to get eaten. It's not going to be able to reproduce. So those traits are not going to show up in the environment. So only the traits, the genes that have allowed them to be successful get to show up from generation to generation. The result of natural selection is a population adapted to its environment. If the environment's still changing, though, we'd say that they're adapting to their environment. Right now, the polar bears are adapting to their environment. They have not adapted because that environment is still changing, and we have yet to see if they will be extinct or not in the next 20 to 50 to 60 years. Some examples of natural selection, the 2 big ones I want to talk about is the female preference for traits can bring about selection of male characteristics. Out in the wild, the females are the ones that actually get to pick who they want to mate with. A lot of times the males don't really have an option. And an example specific to this area is deer. Bucks that are stronger and that have larger antlers will have a better chance of mating with more females. Because a female sees a buck and it has large antlers, she knows he's healthy. She knows she will then have a healthy baby. She's not going to waste her time having a baby with a buck that is unhealthy. Then there's a chance her baby will be unhealthy. And it takes a lot of time and energy, to be pregnant and have a baby. So these bucks with large antlers are going to have sex with more does. So more of their genes get passed on from generation to generation than a buck with small antlers. Okay. Now you may try to argue with me and say, well, there's not a lot of bucks out there with large antlers. Well, that's because we have humans hunting them and killing them. But we can't not do that because otherwise the deer population would become enormous, and then that causes a lot of other issues. The other example I have is something called a peppered moth. Peppered moths are either black or they're white. And before the Industrial Revolution, the trees in certain areas were actually light in color. So these white peppered moths were able to blend in with the white trees. There were some black ones, but they stood out. So the birds ate them. So the black moths were not allowed. They really never had sex. They never had babies. They got eaten. So from generation to generation to generation, the white color is what show up. It's what they were able to blend in with the tree. Industrial Revolution, we had factories being produced. The factories burned coal. Coal is very dirty. It left soot on these trees. The trees didn't turn black, but the outside of them were covered with a black soot from the coal. So as you can imagine, year after year after year, the trees are getting darker and darker and darker. Those white moths were now the ones being eaten. They were not the ones having sex and passing on those white genes. The black or darker moths now were able to survive. They're having kids, and they'll have kids that are dark. So we went from a population of white moths to a population of dark moths over time because the environment changed. So over time, at first, the white moths were selected for, but when the environment changed, the black moths became selected for. And there is going to be a 10-point question on the test over peppered moths, so you may want to look at my website, and I have a rubric set up for that 10-point essay. The next few slides are some pictures of these peppered moths. So you can see here, there's the black peppered moth and the white peppered moth. Here you can see that white peppered moth on the lighter colored trees and how you could understand how it would survive. And if you set a black moth in there, how it would stick out and it would get eaten by birds. And then here is a picture of the dark moth and the white moth on a dark tree, and that white moth distinctly stands out and would easily get eaten by the birds. So really, out in the wild, there's this constant struggle for existence. Only certain members of a population are able to survive and reproduce from generation to generation. This means only certain genes are passed on from generation to generation, and usually it's those good genes, the genes needed for survival. In the biology world, fitness is the ability of an organism to survive and reproduce in its environment. So you may think of being fit as being able to run or jump. Nope, out in the biology world, you have to be able to survive, so you have to have the certain genes, traits in other words, that allow you to stay alive, and then you have to be able to reproduce and have babies. If you can't do those two things, you are not a fit person in the biology world. And the most fit individuals, they get to pass their genes on from generation to generation. So only the fit genes are the ones that are there. Variation again, those differences. Darwin had no idea what caused variations within a population. He did not know because he didn't know anything about genes. We know that genes determine the way we look. Genes determine our traits. So one reason for variation, all of our different genes. We also realize that mutations and combinations of alleles during sexual reproduction can cause variation within a population. You look different than your siblings because there were different alleles that came together to make them than what made you. Populations that lack variation may not be able to adapt to the conditions, and they'll become extinct. For example, the cheetah population out there, they lack variation. Their DNA is almost all the same from one cheetah to the next. If a new disease would suddenly arise in that population and one of them dies, there is a good chance all of them will die because they don't have the variation needed for survival. If one of them dies, all genes are the same, they all die. So lacking variation is a bad thing. You want lots of variation within a population. For with humans, if a new disease suddenly arises, some people will die, maybe even a lot of people, but not everyone's going to go extinct because of one disease, because there will be somebody out there that has the genes needed that allows them to be immune from the disease. And another thing, so Darwin had said diversity on our planet can be due to the interactions between species and their environment. An adaptation, that is a phenotype that helps an organism to be more suited for its environment. For example, manatees, penguins, and sea turtles have flippers. Primates have opposable thumbs. That's our adaptation. It's allowing us to survive in our environment. And so Darwin, what he has done, he gathered evidence that adaptations to various environments results in the diversity of our planet. So the different adaptations needed to survive in the many different environments out there has led to the diversity of our planet. If our planet looked like Southeast Iowa, if everywhere around the world was like it is here, we would not have a very diverse planet. Everything would be the same because only certain traits are needed to survive here. But if you go up into northern Canada, different traits are needed there, different traits are needed in California, different traits are needed in South America. So we have lots of different environments, we have lots of different traits needed, so we have a very diverse planet. Now, if today's species are here because of natural selection, meaning the ones that are able to survive get to pass on their genes, and they're also here because of adaptations from ancient forms, then we should find remains of these species. One example is something called the Archaeopteryx. It has feathers like a bird, but it has teeth. They know it could not fly because of its skeletal structure. So it has both reptile and bird characteristics. It is known as a transitional link. And if you don't know, birds have evolved from reptiles. And this is just one of the many, many transitional links from reptile to bird that they have found over the years. Archaeopteryx is just one example of that. So we do have evidence of natural selection, and one of those evidence happens to be all the fossil records that we have out there.